The reception had been classified as Tier 2, elevated presence, standard perimeter, no recorded threat history against the dignitary in question. Darren Voss had worked Tier 2 assignments for 11 years and knew their particular texture. The background hum of caution maintained at a level that didn't interfere with the social function it was protecting. The way your eyes moved through a room without appearing to move. The specific quality of alertness that looked, from the outside, like a man standing near a wall holding a drink he wasn't going to finish. He was good at Tier 2. He was good at most things that required sustained, quiet attention to the possibility of catastrophe in rooms designed to make catastrophe seem impossible. The grand reception hall of the Varanthi diplomatic mission was exactly such a room. High ceilings, warm lighting calibrated to flattery, the soft acoustic management of a space that had been engineered to make conversation feel intimate regardless of the number of people having it. 200 attendees, most of them human, a third of them Varanthi, tall, fine-boned, with the characteristic pale iridescence along their temples that his briefing materials had described as an indicator of emotional state in ways that were still only partially mapped by human researchers. Ambassador Thessaly stood near the center of the room in the way that people stood near the center of rooms when they were accustomed to being the center of rooms, not performing centrality, simply occupying it, speaking to a cluster of humans from the trade delegation, with the focused attention of someone who found the conversation genuinely interesting rather than professionally necessary. Darren watched her the way he watched everything, without appearing to. The threat came from the catering service corridor. This was, in retrospect, the detail that would appear in every after-action report and every security review for the next 2 years. That the cleared space had not been cleared properly, that the sweep had missed a panel, that the intelligence assessment had weighted threat vectors incorrectly. In the moment, none of this was available to him. What was available was a shift in the peripheral geometry of the room that his training processed before his conscious mind received the analysis. A figure, wrong angle, wrong velocity, something in the hand that was not what it should be, trajectory that terminated at the ambassador. His body moved. This was the only accurate way to describe it, and he had tried to describe it more precisely in his recovery and found he couldn't. His body moved. The decision, if it was a decision, existed somewhere below the threshold of conscious thought, a layer of training so deeply embedded that it had its own response time, faster than the part of him that understood what he was doing and why. He crossed the distance. He put himself in the path. The blow, a concentrated energy discharge, his briefing materials would later confirm, calibrated for a single lethal application against Varanthi physiology, caught him across the left side of his torso with the force of something that had been designed to end a life in one contact. It had not been designed for human physiology. This distinction, his medical team would later point out with the specific enthusiasm of people who found the variants professionally interesting, was probably relevant to his survival. Probably. The last thing he registered before the darkness was the ambassador's face, shock, movement, her hands coming toward him as he went down, and the knowledge, arriving with the clean clarity of a thing that didn't require analysis, that she was upright, that she was alive, that the redirect had worked, then the darkness and nothing. Pain was the first coherent signal, not sharp, which he recognized as pharmaceutical management. The pain was present but processed at a distance, like receiving a report about a situation rather than being in it. He ran a body inventory with the systematic efficiency of someone who had woken up in medical facilities before and knew the protocol. Breathing functional, restricted on the left side, indicating either restraint or structural damage being managed. Heart rate monitored, the soft rhythmic confirmation of equipment doing its job. Temperature elevated, which meant inflammation response, which meant real damage rather than the manageable kind. His arms registered something before his eyes opened. This was not unusual in recovery. Proprioception often returned before vision, before full cognitive function, the body's sense of its own position and contact assembling itself from available signals while the higher processing was still coming back online. What was unusual was what his arms registered, not the expected texture of medical linens, not the restraint architecture of a recovery bed. Warmth, pressure, the specific quality of contact that was not equipment or environment but another living body, present and deliberate, positioned close enough that his returning awareness encountered it before anything else. His left hand, which should have been reporting only the dull edge of managed pain, was instead reporting the firm pressure of something gripping it. Had been gripping it, his body's memory suggested, for long enough that the contact had become part of the baseline, not a new sensation arriving but a continuous one that his consciousness was only now catching up to. He opened his eyes. The room assembled itself in the way rooms did when the pharmaceuticals were still active, edges soft, light slightly too present, the cognitive work of interpretation happening a half-second behind the sensory input. Medical facility, clearly. Varanthe design, which meant the proportions were slightly off from human standard, the ceiling a fraction higher, the equipment arranged with the particular spatial logic of a species whose reach exceeded his by several centimeters. A window in the far wall showing darkness, which meant night cycle, which told him nothing about how long. She was sitting in the chair positioned at a distance of approximately 30 centimeters from his bed, which was close enough that leaning forward put her within arm's reach, which was what she had done. She was leaning forward, her elbow on the edge of the bed, her hand wrapped around his with the careful firmness of someone who had made a decision about grip pressure and maintained it. Her head was lowered. Her eyes were closed. She was asleep. The iridescence along her temples, his returning cognition noted, was doing something his briefing materials had listed under the category of indicators that were still only partially mapped. A color in the blue-adjacent range, shifting. He didn't know what it meant. He knew it was there, and he knew it was present in a face that was, even in exhausted sleep, arranged in an expression he recognized without being able to name, the expression of someone who had made a decision and was still in the process of carrying it. He became aware, gradually and then all at once, that her grip on his hand had tightened slightly, that her head had lifted, that she was awake and looking at him, and that the blue-adjacent iridescence had shifted into something else. "You're back," she said. Her voice was low, which he attributed to the hour and the setting rather than any particular deliberateness, and carried the specific quality of someone who had been speaking quietly for so long that they had forgotten the other register. "Apparently," he said. His own voice came out rougher than he'd expected, which the pharmaceuticals explained. How long? 31 hours since surgery. She did not release his hand. 43 since the reception. He processed this. "You've been here since they brought you from the surgical unit." She said it with the straightforward delivery of someone reporting a fact rather than making a claim. "I will remain until you are strong enough to stand. This is what our traditions require of those whose lives have been shielded. You must not wake alone, and when you wake, you must know that the one you protected survived and is present." Darren looked at her. She looked back with the directness of someone from a species that had apparently not developed the human habit of deflecting sustained eye contact. The iridescence at her temples continued its movement through colors he couldn't map. "That's," he started. "It is not negotiable," she said, not unkindly. "I have been informed by my security team that my presence here creates logistical complications. I have been informed by protocol staff that extended physical contact with a human contractor falls outside established diplomatic interaction guidelines. I have explained to both that the interaction guidelines were written by people who had not recently had someone place their body between them and a lethal discharge, and that the guidelines can, with respect, wait." A pause. "They waited," she said. The next several hours assembled themselves into a rhythm that Darren, who had spent considerable time in medical facilities and knew their particular tedium, found unexpectedly bearable. The medical staff came and went with the efficient discretion of professionals working around a situation they had clearly decided to accept rather than address. Thessaly remained. She released his hand when the staff needed access and reclaimed it when they were finished, with the matter-of-fact continuity of someone executing a commitment rather than making a repeated choice. He slept, woke, slept again. Each time consciousness returned, she was there. And after the third iteration, his nervous system stopped registering her presence as new information and began registering it as baseline. The warmth at his side, simply part of the landscape of waking. The grip on his hand, simply part of what his hand was doing. He found this more disorienting than the pain. "Your people don't do this," she said, during the longest of his waking periods, when the pharmaceutical distance from the pain had reduced enough that full conversation was possible. It was not a question. "Not typically," he said. "What do your people do when someone falls protecting another?" He thought about it. "We file incident reports, medical processing. If the contractor survives, there's usually a debrief once they're functional. Compensation review." She absorbed this with the expression of someone encountering a cultural practice. They were trying to understand from the inside, rather than judge from the outside. "And the person protected sends flowers usually, or the equivalent, a formal acknowledgement." "Flowers," she said, "or a letter, sometimes in person if the relationship warrants it." She was quiet for a moment. The iridescence at her temples moved through the blue-adjacent range again, slower this time. "We believe," she said, "that a body offered as shield becomes briefly sacred, not metaphorically. Our oldest traditions treat the physical sacrifice as a transfer. Something of the protected person's continued existence now belongs, in a real sense, to the one who shielded them. The vigil is the acknowledgement of that transfer. To leave would be to deny it. So you staying is not kindness," she said, "it is accuracy." He looked at the ceiling. "That's a significant tradition. You're a significant reason I'm here to have it." She said it with the same matter-of-fact delivery she'd used for everything else, as though the weight of the statement and the simplicity of the delivery were not, in her framework, in any tension. He had no ready answer for that. He filed it in the category of things that would require processing time he didn't currently have, alongside the warmth at his side and the grip on his hand, and the colors moving at her temples that his briefing materials hadn't adequately explained. The night cycle outside the window gave way, gradually, to the station's artificial dawn. The slow light increase that the facility used to manage biological rhythms across multiple species, calibrated to offend no one specifically and satisfy no one entirely. Darren watched it happen and was aware, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrived in recovery, that he felt more present in this room than he had felt in a room in a long time. Not better, exactly. Just located. As though his coordinates were unusually clear. He thought about the moment his body had moved before his mind finished the calculation. He thought about the knowledge, arriving in the darkness before the impact, that the redirect had worked. He thought about waking up and finding her already there, already present, already gripping his hand with the careful firmness of someone who had made a decision and was keeping it. He had spent 11 years being professionally proximate to people whose safety he was paid to maintain. He had done his job well. He had never once stayed. "When I'm strong enough to stand," he said. "Yes. And then you'll go." She looked at him with the directness he was becoming accustomed to. "Then the formal obligation of the vigil is fulfilled," she said. "What happens after that is not governed by tradition." He held her gaze. The dawn light moved through the room and caught the iridescence at her temples, and whatever color it was doing now, it was one he hadn't seen before. "I might need help," he said, "getting to standing." Something moved across her expression that was not quite what he had briefing material categories for. "I expect you will," she said. "I intend to be here for it." He stood on the 9th day. Not easily, and not without the medical staff's involvement. and definitely not without the particular expression of a man discovering that his left side had opinions about vertical that his right side did not share. The first attempt lasted approximately 4 seconds before the pain made its position clear, and he conceded the argument. The second attempt, an hour later, lasted longer. The third, on the afternoon of the 9th day, resulted in him upright and breathing carefully, and aware that the room had the slightly overlit quality of somewhere his body was not yet fully convinced was real. Thessaly stood 2 steps away, which was close enough to reach him if the standing became falling, and which she had clearly calculated to be exactly that distance and no more. She had not touched him during the attempts. She had been present for all 3, in the chair or standing as he was standing now, and her expression during each had been the expression of someone holding themselves still with intention. He was upright. He was breathing. His left side was making its objections through channels that his pharmaceutical management was doing its best to redirect. "There," she said. "There," he agreed. The formal obligation of the vigil was, by the terms she had described, fulfilled. He had been present when she arrived. He had been present for 31 hours of unconsciousness and 9 days of recovery. She had kept contact through the worst of it, had argued with her security team, had set aside whatever her schedule held to sit in a slightly too small chair in a medical facility calibrated for human biology. She had done what her tradition required. She did not move toward the door. He did not particularly want her to. "I have," she said, after a moment during which the standing required enough of his concentration that conversation had not been fully available, "been asked to return to my formal duties. There are 17 meetings that were postponed during." She made a small gesture that encompassed the general situation. "This." 17, he said, "minimum. That's a significant backlog." "Yes." She looked at him with the directness that he had, over 9 days, stopped finding foreign and started finding simply characteristic. The way she looked at things she found worth looking at. "I find I'm having difficulty with the urgency of it." He said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required, and he had, over 9 days of more conversation than he typically had in a month, discovered that she shared his instinct for silence that wasn't empty. "My people have a second tradition," she said, "less formal than the vigil. It doesn't have a name exactly because the situations that invoke it are rare enough that naming it seemed presumptuous. The concept is approximately when a vigil ends, but the reason for it hasn't." He looked at her. "I'm told," she said, "that my translation implant renders this imprecisely. The original meaning is closer to the shape left by something significant doesn't disappear when the significant thing ends. It remains, and the people who share that shape are, by the logic of it, not yet finished." Darren stood carefully, his left side registering its position in the ongoing discussion, and thought about the moment his body had moved before his mind completed the calculation. He thought about waking up and finding her already there. He thought about 9 days of a room that felt more located than any room had felt in 11 years of professional proximity to people he was paid to keep alive and never stayed for. He thought about the colors at her temples that his briefing materials hadn't adequately explained, and the ones he'd seen over 9 days that his briefing materials hadn't included at all, and the ones she was doing now that he had no category for but was beginning to suspect he could learn. "My contracting agent," he said, "is going to have questions. My protocol staff," she said, "are going to have considerably more. I might need," he said, "a few more days before I'm fully functional." The iridescence at her temples moved into something warm. "I expect," she said, with the matter-of-fact delivery that had become, over 9 days, one of his favorite sounds, "that I can remain available." Outside, the station